a significant part of our American population is uncomfortable with this idea, and they want to go back to a more binary view, and they think you're nuts, and that you're making a lot of crap up, and that this is, postmodernism and so on, and that it's obvious that girls are girls and boys are boys, and so my point is there's a huge politics to this in addition to everything else.
Yes.
No, you're supposed to give a long answer now.
I think yes, it does make people uncomfortable. It threatens most existing power structures, most especially in the home. Who does what and why? What are our expectations around whose time is valuable and whose time is not, and how do we get to spend our days? In relation, also has very vast implications for public policy, and then things about daily life. Like I think when you were talking about the people who would say this is a bunch of hooey. When people think about like the discussions about bathrooms, right? That's
one of them.
That's one of them. And those were some of the same debates and the tactics that Phyllis Schlafly and her colleagues used to defeat the ERA in the 1970s and 1980s, right? What would it mean if they were gender-neutral bathrooms? What would it mean if women could be drafted? So it gets at people's inner core about what they think is the most, not sacred, but timeless element of life.
I think settled categories.
Yeah, settled categories, yeah.
Historians, like most people, don't like change, right? Human beings don't like change. But historians like to think about how very few things are actually immutable. I think we are comfortable as human beings saying, well, okay, everything else may change. The Cubs may win the World Series. But, all right, so everything may change. But what doesn't change is that I'm a woman and you're a man. And these things, that is the one thing you can take to the bank. Okay, and when historians start to say, actually, what it meant to be a woman or a man in 1660 or the year 10 or what it will be like in 2070, may be pretty different. That's part of it. that's what else doesn't change. The one thing that most people say isn't going to change is the fact is gender.
So are you?
And look, and now we can even change genders, right? So your daughter's born a girl, but there are people out here who know people, if you don't, who are biologically born one thing and decide they want to be something else. So a lot of people, that's really masculine nature. Okay, that crosses all kinds of moral, ethical, spiritual, religious lines, for people. But I think it's discomfort with change is part of it, because historians and American studies folks and women's studies folks and other scholars, sociologists, can say, when we say gender is a construct, what we're saying is that the definition of gender, expectations for gender, change over time, and they're created by that society. The society creates what that society comes to define as female, expected for male, and so forth.
So expectations, creation of cultural norms and expectations is societally constructed. It's not inevitably natural that burbles out from the very nature of our biology.
Yes, it's no different from, say, take a term like patriotism. What we define as patriotic today is different from what we define as patriotic in 1916 in the middle of World War I, which is what we define as differently from, say, right after 9/11 happened. So patriotism, we all have a kind of a basic understanding of what patriotism is. So what's acceptably patriotic today might not be acceptably patriotic in 1864 or 1944.
So we're grossly oversimplifying a very complex set of courses and arguments and books and treatises. But you all get it, right? What they're talking about. So you can. I won't ask how many reject it out of hand. I'm sure some do. But my mother certainly would if she were here. She'd be all over us. But I think I remember hearing you say last night, too, that some of our simplistic categories of gay, straight, lesbian, bi-curious, that these taxonomies are, on the whole, not very helpful.
I didn't say that they weren't helpful. I said that they were, does anyone want to guess? Historically contingent and constructed.
They're constructed.
that they have a history, that these ideas have a history. So it's not an arbitrary history. I wasn't trying to dismiss it, but that the ideas and these names have a history. So I was referencing the work of scholars such as George Chauncey, who I think is still at Yale, and he has studied the evolution of, his big book is called Gay New York. So how did a gay subculture emerge in New York? What did it mean to be gay? And also he's found that this was not a category that really existed in any meaningful way in the 19th century in the way that we think it is today, that one's sexuality historically wasn't really an identity category. It may have been something that you did occasionally, but it didn't define you. It wasn't like a box you would check to say, I am this way. That there was a wider variety of behaviors and experiences that constructed an identity, and that sexuality wasn't necessarily one in the same way that we think of it today.
So people will say to me sometimes, were there homosexuals in Jefferson's time? Complex question, because you want to say, no, that category, of course, but that category didn't exist really.
Well, in the way that they were thinking, they were trying to say, did men engage in sex with men, and did women have sex
Which is,
with
of course.
Yes. Would they have considered themselves hetero or homosexual in the way that
We
would be
might
today?
well, yeah.
Probably not.
Okay, so for both of you, does this conversation that we've had in any way help us understand the Roosevelts? Any of the women in the Roosevelt clan, does it help, does the idea of that gender is a construction, a social construction, does that help us understand our Roosevelts? Well, how about both of you?
I would say overwhelmingly, yes, especially to Teddy Roosevelt, because so much of his public life, his private life, his charismatic persona, as I hope, even if you dismiss this gender discussion, I think at least we can agree that masculinity and his portrayal of masculinity was an integral part of his person and his public performance. So I think in that way, yes, and I think understanding the tropes and the metaphors and the ideas that he imbued, and either consciously or subconsciously, helped him to construct this Rough Rider image, this virile, strenuous life that he wanted for himself and his compatriots. I think that helps us understand some of his motivations, his concerns, his fears.
Especially because these are ideas and words that he used. So we're not putting this on him as historians.
Right.
He wrote about the duties of being a man. He wrote about the duties of being a woman. So as historians, we can't understand what the duties of a man are until we understand what he understood by a man.
Okay, but Stacy, in your first book on Roosevelt, you talked about these early influences on TR, his reading particularly, because he was an invalid in so many ways and couldn't enjoy outdoor activities the way some others of his age did. So his father probably wasn't constructing TR's gender in the way that it came out, parts of it, but not all of it. But some early reading really had a constructive element, Main Read and so on. Can you talk about a sick boy's deep reading as a child and the construction of his adult personality?
You could probably do this better because I think you know where you're going, but
Okay,
Far from clear.
that didn't come out right.
Yeah, no.
I just mean, he's, sorry, I apologize,
No, it's fine.
I just mean, in Clay's head, he's got examples because he pulled out Main Read, and so I think he's, so one of the types of literature that Roosevelt tells us that he really loved, and actually Catherine's going to talk more about this later possibly, involved great deeds of daring do on the part of young men. So great Western novels, great novels about medieval knights and so forth. He loved that kind of reading.
Walter Scott. Okay.
Sir Walter Scott, absolutely. And so, I don't know, what are you asking me? What did that do for his
So
construction
his
of
father's
himself?
not really the kind of
Right.
guy who's going to go out and wrestle calves. His father's a very refined
Right.
New York gentleman. So that construction might have come to a certain degree from his brother Eliot, whom he worshipped, but mostly it comes from his reading and maybe from his uncles on his
Yeah,
mother's
I was gonna
side. But Main Read talks about boys who go out into the frontier and then have to track down thieves or kill a white buffalo and bring it back,
Yeah.
and so on. And so these are adventure stories involving the frontier, the cult of masculinity, violence, law and order, the taming of the West, and expressing yourself in a heroic way beyond what appear to be the boundaries of your capacity. Is that a fair reading of these books?
Yes, and two things. Let's not leave out his mother, because the stories of the gallant Southerners factored into his understanding of what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a young man, what it means to be a man. Also, I think you might be selling Greatheart a little short here, because I think it's
His father, you mean?
His father. I think it's quite possible that to young T.D., his dad loomed large. I mean, literally loomed large in his life. And if one scholar that we read is correct, as Mitty became more sort of nebulous and faded a bit, withdrew from the family, his father would then sort of take that space and become that larger picture. So I don't want to take away from Theodore Sr. and he may have been, he may not have been, wrestling cattle, but he was doing other great masculine work in the world.
Christian soldier
All
work.
of the philanthropic work that he did, one day a week completely out of his life to go do charitable work, for example, very much in keeping with that kind of muscular Christianity that was a Quran at the time. So how does all this factor into a young child who's got severe problems with asthma? I think we can all assume that it helped him understand one possible path ahead for himself, right? If you are an invalid when you're a child, you can fight back, or you can somehow come to a different sort of peace with it. And Roosevelt learned that he fought back, and it was his father who said, Theodore, you have to make your body. Right?
Your mind is strong as your body is
You've got
weak.
the mind, but your body's weak. You must make your body. And apparently Roosevelt said, I will make my body.
I will,
so,
Papa.
So he did. And so he rose to that challenge, in part by taking in and owning these masculine tropes, what it means to be a boy. I read about here, I read about it there, I read about it here. And to Roosevelt, this would have seemed unchanging, right? From medieval knights to his father going out to battle corruption in New York City, that's all of a piece.
Okay, the other part I want to do before we move in a slightly different direction is ask about the reactive in Roosevelt. So he could have been an upper class dandy who drank a lot and smoked and went to the fashionable parties and drove an automobile and womanized and led a frivolous gambling life. And he had many, many, many contemporaries who did that. And he rejected that with great violence. So that's the cultural gender construction expectation for his class was more down that line than it was the Owen Wister line. But he reacted against that, partly, I think, because of his brother. So can you explain why his brother was a negative influence, Elliot?
No one can. Well, think, Aunt Anna Gracie, she couldn't really explain it. People saw Elliot going down the wrong path, but nobody could really explain what went wrong. Elliot was the better looking brother. Elliot was the more charming brother. Elliot had a better sort of gift of gab.
Athletic.
He was much more athletic. He was the better shot. He could see better, right? Everybody liked Elliot better because he wasn't quite as bumptious as young TR was. So what went wrong there? He was the golden child.
He was insecure?
Possibly he was insecure in himself, but he came to believe that his younger brother, TR, was better at everything than he was. He came to believe that he was not as, well loved even as TR was. So
He was TR's hero, and Corinne tells the story of the deathbed. You know that story, and TR had to get really tough with his brother, cut him off financially, separate him from mistresses, cut him off from alcohol and drugs. All sorts of really tough love things. And then Elliot died, and Corinne says, Theodore wept like a baby. I've never seen him weep the way he did over the death of his brother. So you see a loss there and a reaction. I'm never going to be that guy. So in some respects, that's a useful construction for TR.
yeah, and this is completely conjecture, right? And we are not psychologists or trained in that way. But so maybe if you are of the belief that his mother became weaker and more nebulous, that word is just a strange word to apply to her, but if she became weaker in this way and abrogated her duty, then maybe what Roosevelt wanted to do was not be like Elliot, not be like his mother, not be that kind of, vapid, vacuous, I'm not
Retiring,
yeah, rather than coming full forward, more like his father than his mother, perhaps.
Kimberly, this is for you. I had a friend here in Dickinson when I was growing up, and his mother spent most of her time in her bedroom. I almost never saw her. We were inseparable, but she was always ill with an unspecified illness, and she lived this life of profound retirement. In TR's time, that would be called neurasthenia. What is neurasthenia, and how is that a social strategy for some women?
That's a great question. So, okay, so neurasthenia, raise your hand if you've heard of this term before. Okay.
That's more than I would have thought.
Me too. I'm going to call that 1/3. Okay. So neurasthenia was another epidemic at the end of the 19th century. Today we might think of it as depression or anxiety, but it was a loss of nerves, and it affected both men and women. Scholars have written a lot about it, and it has to do with some of the same cultural changes that I mentioned today during my talk that prompted this crisis of masculinity. And it also has to do with some that I didn't mention, including the spread and discovery of electricity. So people at the end of the 19th century were very concerned about energy. And this is because the ways in which electricity changed the landscape of your life in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Imagine you are a person who, when you are born in 1850, how do you get to town? You walk or you ride your horse. How do you know when it's time to go to bed? When the sun goes down. When is your workday going to conclude? When the sun goes down. Okay? By the end of the 19th century, your life has totally changed. There are gas lights in the streets. There are streetcars and trolleys. The work world has changed. Your whole daily routine has changed, and people become very concerned. Do I have enough energy? Now, I don't have to stop working when the sun goes down because there's a light I could turn on. Then there's an expectation that you're supposed to turn it on. There are activities going on. You could be downtown, you could be here, you could be there. The spread of news, the spread of magazines, there's a lot more information to keep up with. We can maybe relate a little bit now with our smartphones in our pocket constantly going off as we're just trying to sit here and enjoy being together. So this prompts a lot of concerns about energy. So that's another kind of context that prompts this concern about neurasthenia. People are feeling weak. People talk about it in terms of energy. They feel enervated, weakness. Now, women often expressed it in the ways that Charlotte Perkins-Gilman did that we learned about last night, which I think it makes the most modern corollary to think about it in terms of depression for us women, often of childbearing age, often around the time in which they are either having or not able to have or losing babies, become morose. Loss of energy, wanting to stay in bed, or women who, it also afflicted a lot of women like Charlotte Perkins-Gilman, who were ambitious, who were not satisfied with what they were supposed to be doing, and became frustrated and were told basically to do the exact thing they didn't want to do, which was to be infantilized and lie in bed and be spoon-fed milk and soft bread all day. Now, so for men, neurasthenia had similar symptoms, but again, the opposite cure. So it's sort of a late 19th century nervous disorder, emotional, but that people talked about it in terms of an epidemic, that it struck the middle and upper classes in particular, and I think it's a response to this, the vast shift in lifestyle that happens at the end of the 19th century in so many ways.
It struck male clerks, especially. Right? So if your job was not doing honest work out there in the farm, for example, but you were behind a desk and you were fiddling with numbers and so forth. And so your whole day was spent indoors, and you didn't lift anything heavy, you didn't push anything heavy, you didn't really do battle with anything. Those were the men most affected with neurasthenia.
So Bartleby the Scrivener.
Exactly. And the question of how did women utilize this? Well, that's a kind of a cynical way to ask it.
But women could, in a sense, check out.
Yes.
And go to their rooms, and I'm sure this had some birth control.
I was going to say that.
Go ahead.
One thing that has struck me in researching the book I'm writing right now, a biography, is and again, this is something you probably did not expect to hear at the TR Symposium, but is the historical shifts and the prominence of syphilis and gonorrhea in the 19th century. So people talk about falling birth rates, people talk about the rise of the women's movement, and one of the things I'm going to try to highlight in this book and other writings is a lot of this, I think, through my research, is prompted by this epidemic of sexually transmitted disease, and that it was often the men who contracted it from visiting prostitutes. They weren't allowed to talk about this with their wives. They would go home to the wives, bring the disease, and I found the most horrifying examples of doctors not telling the wives. Wives will go for treatment, say, I don't know what's wrong with me. They don't tell the wives the truth. And so one way to get out, and also it's very in veiled language about in the voluntary motherhood campaign and the white slavery, anti-prostitution campaign, a lot of these fears that these women reformers have are basically about not wanting to get an STD from their husband, whose activities they cannot control, to whom they cannot say no at home, and they have no treatment. So,
And they have children.
and they have children who get, who inherit these diseases and are, deformed for life in some cases, not always. So to say that women, so I would put a slightly different spin on these women who took to their bed with illness. They were making a logical and reasoned and I think in some cases decision to try to get out of being with their husbands in that way. It was syphilis and gonorrhea, doctors in the 19th century said were more prevalent than all other infectious diseases combined.
This is part of why there's a change in how society looks at prostitution from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era. So Progressive Era reformers take a sort of a different tact on this altogether because of this rising prevalence and because of what it's doing, not just to wives who were supposed to be pure and protected and so forth, but to their children.
As long as we're going down these taboo paths here, let's talk about smut for a minute. Roosevelt was a very serious crusader against smut, and on several occasions he actually insisted that his postmaster general arrest people for crimes that were not on the books. And I mean, Roosevelt believed that the degradation of human sexuality through pornography and obscenity was was corrosive in the most powerful way to civilization. That boat has left the dock, I think, in our time. But this is also part of this issue of the dark underbelly of Edwardian and Victorian society that we don't think about a lot, but this is going on all over. Roosevelt had several friends who were dabbling in pornography.
Okay, so yes, and also trying to stop the spread of pornography. So this, again, the anti-vice crusades start around the same time, late 1860s, 1870s, after the Civil War, when for the first time, young men and young women can no longer stay on the family farm. They move to the cities to get jobs. Now, young men in particular move to cities, and they don't live anymore in like an apprentice situation where someone is there to watch over them. They live in rooming houses. They live in the city. They can go to the bars after work and the taverns, and they can have fun, and they're young men in the city. So people, like some of the men in Roosevelt's circle, and the YMCA is founded largely around issues such as this, start crusading against vice. Now, the thing that's tricky is, what is vice in particular? So the leading anti-vice crusader, Anthony Comstock, convinces Congress to pass a law, which is now called the Comstock Laws. It's a series of laws, but they define obscenity in the grandest, most sweeping, sort of confusing possible terms. So to include also things about free love, critiques of marriage, and birth control. So the laws are on the books as of the early 1870s that it's illegal to transmit through the mails or in person to buy and sell any information that's obscene. So this could be outright, pornography, or it could be things as simple as an anatomy textbook that shows people their pieces and parts.
Well,
right?
Sanger's book on birth control was banned.
So the quote that I read you today from Sanger was her protesting against Comstock, because Comstock was used to shut down feminist critiques of marriage, feminist critiques of prostitution, any discussion of sex, which women wanted to be discussing in some ways, not to be impure, but to say, my husband is visiting prostitutes and bringing home syphilis, and I don't know how I'm supposed to, grapple with this or talk about it. So the Comstock laws were used, yes, to cut down on pornography and the sporting magazines in cities like New York, but also on these reformist and sometimes radical conversations about sex, who gets to have it, and what are we allowed to say about it. And so Sanger's quote was to say, wait a minute, I'm telling people to have less sex or less babies, and I'm getting arrested, and TR is telling people to have sex all the time, and he gets to go out and say this without penalty?
He doesn't talk about sex.
Well, he doesn't talk about sex, he talks about reproduction. So it's
Breeding.
Okay.
Here.
Question. Has anyone ever looked at Theodore Roosevelt's true core sexuality? And his behavior seems to be a lot of overcompensation.
Calling
Looking at
Dr.
TR's
Freud.
true sexual core and the idea that some of his behavior is compensatory and from insecurities.
I just need to tell you that conversation only happens after historians have had a glass of wine.
No, I think we should go ahead and have it.
Go ahead,
No, no,
That's what you started on last night.
No.
Oh, no, it
I
was
did not.
you. It was Catherine.
I think this is a,
She'll be up later.
So his core sexuality, you're suggesting that he doth protest too much by being the sort of over hypermasculine thing? Yeah, okay, so let me give you a serious answer to that. And this goes back to part of what you asked, I think, Kimberly, earlier, about his friends. What did he think about Lodge and so forth? I think to address that with Roosevelt, I think we have to add the overlay of his incredible competition. He was so competitive. So maybe part of it was overcompensation over, but I think he was friends with Lodge and the rest of them, didn't worry about their kind of masculinity because he won. Like in that room, he was always the most masculine guy, so he always won. So it was like kind of relaxing for him because he didn't have to posture. You know, he was the guy who did jujitsu and, you know, shot bison and whatever. And so I think that might be profitable to think about if I were more of a scientist, but I think the competition part is a big part of it. Go ahead, Steve.
More about his sexual orientation.
His orientation, his own sexual expression.
He's actually gay, and he's compensating
Whoa.
for that because it appears
Is he a gay man pretending to be a straight man?
I don't see a lot of evidence for that in my own work. Now, you know, I don't see a lot of evidence for that. I don't see Roosevelt being sort of, what's the word, sexually what's that word? Not dysfunctional, dysphoria. So I don't see that in him. I don't see any, I mean, remember that if gender is a societal construct, then we have different ways to speak to one another in the 19th century than we do today. So the letters that women would write to one another in the 19th century today would be looked at completely differently. And if you got a letter like that from your woman friend today, you might really wonder. So the conversation is different, the word choice is different, how they respond to one another. You know, this is a time when Roosevelt was young, when women existed and men existed in what we call homosocial circles, right? Men hung out generally as men together, did their own thing together. Women hung out as women and did their own thing together. And there wasn't a lot of mixing, even in courtship. Courtship even happened in large groups usually, and as it did for TR. So I, as a scholar of Roosevelt and of the Roosevelt women, don't see any kind of evidence to question Roosevelt's essential, sexuality.
Yeah, let me take just a quick stab at that. Here's what we think we know, and I'm going to use these simplistic terms that we're supposed to have overcome. So far as we know from all of the evidence, Roosevelt was a virgin when he was married. He talks about it and says that he's kept himself pure, that he has avoided temptations that others in his class have been engaged in, and that he has kept himself pure for this moment. So we know he had sex with Alice because she gave birth to a child. Then he had a second wife, and depending on how you count, she was pregnant between 7 and 8 times, several miscarriages. So relatively frequent pregnancies in the course of her fertile bearing years. So they had to have a good sex life, we think. And he obviously had swimmers. And so, you know, it worked. He was not impotent. So
he did not need his penis scope.
he did not need the penis scope. So And then he said,
And he signed himself his letters to his wife. We have very few, but he signed them "Your Own Lover."
right.
I mean, as though he took pride in that. It was a part of who he was and what he enjoyed.
And I think it's fair to say, I mean, I know, for example, Jefferson, and Jefferson's sexual history has some bumps in it. And not just the Sally Hemings story, but there are some bumps on the road. With Roosevelt, you don't get any evidence from anything that he wrote or was ever written about him that there was adultery of any sort, that he ever strayed, and there's no evidence of any sort of a homoerotic relationship, much less a homosexual relationship. So I think it's fair to say that this guy was a towering, monogamous,
Straight guy.
heterosexual, almost like no other figure in our history.
And, let's remember that Roosevelt was gone for a long time in that safari. He was gone for a long time in Brazil with men. And there's no hint from any correspondence from anybody who was there. There's not even a whisper of gossip about it. Nothing.
No, I don't think he ever said what happens on the River of Doubt stays on the River of Doubt.
He never said that. But man, what a T-shirt that would be.
Yeah. Talk about doubt. Yeah.
To move a little from the sex arena.
I'm sorry if we offended you, madam.
Not at all. But I'm very curious at your take on that quote from Edith regarding Alice, and that had she lived, Theodore Roosevelt would have been bored to death.
Would TR been bored to death by Alice?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So who said that was the second wife?
Yes.
Who was spurned. Remember that they, for those of you who might not know, Edith and TR were childhood sweethearts, as I said, and there was a break in their relationship. So it looked to people like they were going to be married. They were headed that way. There was something that happened at the summer house, and the relationship between them broke apart. He went to Harvard, fell head over heels in love with this beautiful Boston Brahmin. And it was later that Edith said to Alice, her stepdaughter, "Thank heavens your mother didn't live, because if she had, your father would have been bored silly with her."
So double cruelty.
Really cruel.
Cruel to Alice in addition to being
Really
cruel, period.
And Edith had that cruel streak. I've seen it. I've read it. So was that the jealous wife, the second wife? She could never, ever be the first wife. And if you're the second wife and you're replacing a woman who died, you can't be that ugly about her, right? And you wouldn't have been in that era. We didn't speak ill of the dead. So there's that going on. There's also the question I have partly from the research for this symposium, which is, was Alice in some way retiring and becoming more nebulous in the same way Mitty did? Because who were the big personalities? Bammy, Corinne, TR, right? Maybe if the three of them sucked all the oxygen out of the room, maybe Alice was like, yeah, I'm just going to go do the archery that I like to do and leave you all Roosevelts to it. It's possible that was maybe played a role in that kind of little Alice stuff, I don't know. It's a good question. But it's a harsh and cruel thing, and Alice never forgot it.
Out here.
Yes, you touched on TR and how he affected his children. Can you tell us what happened to his children?
Can you just run through the children's lives in a very brief compass?
Why don't you do the guys?
I can do a little. So, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. spent his whole life trying to be equal to Theodore Roosevelt Sr.'s expectations. And it was really a sad story because he didn't have enough, and TR drove him pretty hard without even really wanting to.
He's the one who had a breakdown when
And he had a nervous breakdown at Groton, and then TR said, "I'll never push him again," and then of course he went right back to pushing him. And Ted lived in the shadow of his father. He had an unsuccessful political career, but he was a great warrior, and so he was both in World War I and World War II. He was pronounced totally disabled from a military point of view in the Great War, and yet he got himself into World War II because he was a Roosevelt, and that's what his father would have wanted. And he was at D-Day.
With a cane.
And he died a month later of a massive heart attack. He's the only U.S. Army officer who was ever pronounced completely disabled twice by the United States Army. He had this heroic need to please his father, even long after his father was dead. He won the Medal of Honor. Archie also was severely wounded, actually more severely wounded in World War I. Archie became a very strong conservative, a John Birch conservative in his later adult life. He was on the board of readers at Harvard, and he became a red baiter during the Cold War. Kermit, my favorite Roosevelt, your favorite Roosevelt boy, Kermit was in World War I, but he worked for the British. He was in the British Expeditionary Force in the Middle East in what was then called Mesopotamia. He was somewhat wounded. He was the most susceptible to alcohol and the lifestyle of his Uncle Elliot. He drank too much. There were too many women. He maybe had a form of PTSD after the Great War. He never really could find himself. He drifted. He left his wife a number of times and would be found in a hotel room in Seattle or a hotel room in Chicago with a woman. He made a real mess out of his life. But just a couple of better things about him. He got to go on the two great adventures. First, to Africa with his father on the safari, and secondly, on the River of Doubt trip, and he played a critical role on the River of Doubt trip. Edith regarded Kermit as her favorite. She called him my blonde boy with the black heart, which is pretty strong, another cruelty. When this horrible thing happened that I want to write about, and I know Stacy does, when TR died on January 6, 1919, Archie was here at Long Island, and he sent a cable, famous cable, saying the old lion is dead. The others were in Paris, convalescing and waiting for the war to end. And Kermit had been out drinking all night, and he came back in the morning to learn that his father had died, and that really affected him because that's exactly how you don't want to get the news that Theodore Roosevelt is dead, behaving like the kind of jackass that Roosevelt really despised. And he wrote to his mother and said, "The bottom has fallen out of my life." So he's kind of a tragic figure. He's a great writer, great adventurer, romantic figure, the most sensitive of the children. He eventually was posted by FDR to Camp Robinson near Anchorage just to keep him out of trouble until the Second War ended. And he committed suicide on June 3rd, I think, 1943. Put a gun to his head and died. And so, you know, the thing you realize is what a burden it is to be the child of Theodore Roosevelt, I think.
I'll go further and say what a burden it is to be the child of any president of the United States of America.
And you were going to do the women.
Quentin died behind enemy lines. He went down, and he was a pilot, and he was shot down behind enemy lines in World War I, so he died. The youngest child died first. Alice lived, she was the firstborn and the last to die of all of Roosevelt's children, and she had, well, I kind of think, a pretty incredible life. And she was, in many ways, very much like her father, and the one who was the most political of them all. For 60 years, she ruled over Washington, D.C. society and politics and had many adventures and influenced a lot of people and did some things her father would not really approve of and some things that he would have. And Ethel was that kid. Ethel was, everybody said Ethel was like Bammy. Ethel was the sturdy, I'll get it done, I won't complain about it, it's all fine, don't worry, I'll take care of it, kid. And so she had a pretty good marriage, as far as we could tell at the end of the day. She had her 4 children. She had troubles with the children, but that was later in life. And she was also kind of a helper to her mother and to her father, both of them. Later on, she would do some good work, opposite of Archie, on Long Island, trying to get the house prices down in Long Island? Mm-hmm. Because she knew that people of smaller means, especially African Americans, couldn't afford these houses, even though they wanted to live there because they worked near there. So she did some work that sort of shades into civil rights work, if you will. But all of them felt the burden. And I will say to Ted suffered under the additional burden of having Alice basically take TR's place. When TR died, Alice just stepped right into his shoes, pushing Ted, go be president, go be president. So go be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's great, check that box, right? And go, go, go. And Alice was so powerful. She marshaled all of her forces to try to get Ted into the nation's highest office, and it just didn't work.
And for those of you who are North Dakotans, I don't know if this story is true, but that doesn't stop Shyla Schaefer from having told it, that Harold went to Washington, D.C. to see Alice. Alice was very old by that time, and he was taking her a rifle that had belonged to T.R. Harold Schaefer's the man who created Medora. And she was having a perfunctory meeting with this fellow, and he said something that really pleased her, and she said, "Oh, we've got a real man here," and pulled in court and demanded whiskey. This may not be true, but
Sounds like it would be.
Shyla loved the story that Harold was virile enough to please Alice.
Actually, I've heard very similar stories from other people I interviewed for the book, so I'm going to say, call it, own it.
If Shyla were here, we'd have no choice. A few more questions if we have some here. Yes?
Conjecture, but if Roosevelt's daughter Alice had actually been born male, would TR have treated her differently when she was a child?
Well, good question. Had Alice been a boy, and his mother presumably dies on February 14th, would TR have treated that boy child differently from this girl child?
Yes. Yes, and for all the reasons that, Kimberly has talked about, because he did treat his children differently. He treated his daughters differently than he treated his sons in all kinds of ways, both large and small. Now, if your question is, would he have handed a son off to his sister to raise, that's pretty interesting, and I confess I have never thought of that question before.
Neither. Would he have kept the son?
Yeah, and so here's my sort of visceral response to that is, yes, he would have given the son to Bambi to raise at that moment because he was devastated by grief, devastated, and because that was her societal role. She was the unmarried member of the family of age, so yes, she just would have taken that child. But my guess is that as soon as he could, he would have taken that son right back into his family.
And brought him on all sorts of adventures
And treated him just like the boys, yeah. That's a great question.
But he was so reluctant to talk about his daughter's mother. Would he have been as reluctant to talk about his son's mother, do you think?
I don't know.
No way of knowing.
No way of knowing.
Okay, we have time for a few more if you have them, yes?
What kind of information has been gleaned from the vast number of descendants to date?
What kind of information has been gleaned from the vast number of descendants to date? Well, they keep finding new papers, new scrapbooks, new photographs, new this and that. So there's, Roosevelt left just a gigantic footprint in this country. He spoke everywhere, he was everywhere. He was given gifts everywhere. He wrote about people more than most memoirists ever do. So we have a lot of Roosevelt footprint, and we keep finding new things, which is great. The family finds them, the TRA finds them, and descendants. The descendants are not a monolith. They don't all agree about how to think about Roosevelt. And I've gotten to know a few of them. Some of them regard the great man as a historical figure that they happen to be related to, but they don't have any particular deep ownership of him. And others regard themselves as the protector of the flame and are exceedingly prickly and protective of TR. And so the whole spectrum of attitudes. And each of of course, TR and Edith had personalities. Each of the children had personalities. All of their children have had personalities. And so you get a huge spectrum of possibilities, political and economic. Some hunt, some don't. Some are intellectuals, some are people of action. I think it's fair to say nobody in the whole line has gotten a whole dollop of Roosevelt. How could you? I mean, no one can get all of it.
If you know about the descendants, do the apparent problems with alcohol and depression continue?
The streak of alcoholism, depression, and other antisocial activity in the family, do you have any sense of this, how it plays out?
It certainly cropped up in Franklin Ellen's.
I know, I come from a family of alcoholics, so I know that it doesn't just stop at the grave of one person, that there are, talk about construction. So we don't know enough, and it wouldn't really be appropriate, I don't think, for us to try to speculate about this. But I'm guessing that in the several hundred people that call themselves Roosevelts, you'll find just about all that there is to find in human nature. Yes?
What do you think is the most important unanswered question in the area of gender and Roosevelt?
What's the most important unanswered question in the area of Theodore Roosevelt, gender and women?
Well, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
Thank you, Professor. I think I think we'll all have our own, obviously, but for me, the question that I was trying to grapple with in preparing for this talk and that I keep thinking about is, why was it that Roosevelt couldn't see women beyond women as mothers? So, I mean, I think like for Stacy's wonderful talk today,
Meant nothing to you, clearly.
but he wanted,
Exactly.
but for everything Stacy said, I would say, yes, but. Like, yes, he wanted women to do this, but he didn't want women to vote or be involved in public affairs as people or as individuals. He wanted them to do it as mothers or towards motherly goals like the protection of children, which is different than saying you are a person who can be involved in transportation reform and street cleaning because you care about street cleaning. It was under always the auspices of motherhood. So for me, the unanswered question is, and part of it's his time. It would have been unusual for him to think about women as people and not as mothers, but not unheard of. So when he, in that commencement address we've been talking a lot about, where he advocates sort of for women's suffrage, he says he supports it, but he also says it's totally impractical. So now, and that was his take on suffrage for a long time, but he was a man who thought and did legions of unpractical, borderline impossible things. And women as people was not, that was Jane Addams, many of the reformers he knew advocated for women to be able to do all sorts of things above and beyond things authorized by being mothers. But he couldn't, and even though he knew many of these women, he couldn't, I don't think, articulate a vision of womanhood that was not subsumed under mothers.
I think I disagree with that a little bit. I think you both said it in your talks, that the norm for a woman was marriage, ex-children. But he was willing to create a fair number of exceptions if you were divorced, if you were a tremendously gifted novelist like Edith Wharton, if you were important enough to the society that we could allow you as a special entity not to do this.
If you were a Western woman,
Yep.
right? He's got examples of women in the Dakotas and elsewhere.
So I think that he allowed, his view was, yes, every woman should have children. If for some reason you can't, if your husband has an STD, if you are impotent, or he is, if you had a bad marriage and were divorced and now have a room of your own and you're writing books, that's okay, it's not ideal, but I will prize those women as long as they haven't shirked, for any obvious and easy reason, their primary function in life.
So
Yes.
they will have fulfilled not, their civic duty would have been fulfilled by some kind of good work in the world.
Compensatory work,
Towards children and families.
preferably. But Wharton is writing, Wharton has an affair while her invalid husband is still alive. She's divorced. She writes 50 books. The books are not exactly about domesticity. And Roosevelt is a huge fan of hers. And so I think it's your point of view that we have to be careful not to oversimplify this complex. Man, he liked women a lot. He liked strong women particularly. You'll talk about it. So Sharon, so we're out of time, right? Wasn't this fun?
Thank you.